Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to Creating Predictable Host Environments to Support African American Male Students. I want to thank you for spending time with us today. Our presenters today are going to be Jacqueline Peterson from CharlotteMecklenburg Schools. Myself, I'm Edwin Wilson with CharlotteMecklenburg Schools. And also our content facilitator is Tim Lewis with the University of Missouri. And so just want to remind everyone in terms of our matrix, in terms of be responsible, be respectful, and be safe. In terms of making sure, and that goes for the overall event, also as far as chat, but also in our polls to try to live up to those expectations. Just in terms of another reminder, if you're looking for your sessions within Pathable, how to go to the agenda and then look at your schedule, your sessions, but more specifically for my agenda, which actually, and then you'll find all your sessions that you've signed up for. Okay. And then in terms of navigating the session page, take a look at the session details, which has title, presenter, date and time. And then there's a join session button to actually go into the live session, and then also interacting through the chat, the polls, and uploaded files. And we don't have any polls for our presentation today, but then please use the chat to ask questions. But also too, at the end, there's also uploadable files that we hope will be helpful for you. And then during the chat, we want you to be engaging, Tim Lewis actually will be monitoring the chat for us, and we will stop at a couple of different points in the presentation to answer any questions that you may have. Be careful about navigating away from our session. You may click, we don't want to lose anyone, so you may click over to another tab, and you may, hopefully we want you to come back. So just be careful in terms of when you navigate away so that you will be able to find your way back to our session. And also, as always, there's support available throughout the conference by clicking on the help desk, and folks will be there to answer any questions that you may have. So into the meat of our presentation, and as I said, this is creating predictable host environments to support African American male students. And also, I want to call attention to other supporting organizations, which CharlotteMecklenburg Schools here in Charlotte, North Carolina, RTI International, which was our research partner in this 3-year project, but also the National Institutes of Justice, which funded our project. So presentation objectives for today is that we're going to provide an overview of the funded research project. We're going to share updates of the project, including the impact of COVID-19 and remote instruction. COVID-19 and remote instruction impacted everyone. The world is a different place right now. So we want to talk about how it also impacted us. And also going to explore the journey from research concept to scaling up in a large district. And so many times, we have a project or we do it at a same level, but it's not quite the same when you transition to what I will say is the actual world. So a lot of times our research projects are kind of these controlled, kind of sterile environments, but then going to scale is a different story. And so we're going to also talk about where we are with that. 5 things that we want you to consider as part of the presentation. How does this compare to your priorities? What team would oversee this work? When we're talking about equity, when we're talking about African American males, or just talking about any group with equity, who oversees it? What should we stop doing to make room for this work? It's very important that we're always adding on, but for every something we add on, we got to look at what can we stop doing to take things off people's plates. And I will tell you, this is probably one of the biggest issues that teachers are having this year, is that more things are being added on and nothing's really being taken off. And then ultimately, how will we assess whether it's implemented well and is it working? So we have to look at those fidelity data as well as outcome data, no matter what we're doing. So just a little bit in terms of our presenters, again, Jacqueline Peterson, my name is Edwin Wilson. At CMS, we're the 17th largest district in the US. Our enrollment is around 144,000. I think it's a little bit less at this point since we had our 20-day count. We have 180 schools, 19,000 staff. And what's important here, our average high school enrollment is 2,000. And I put that in there because our research study is just for high schools. And so we have a couple of high schools in our district that actually are over 3,000 students. So tiny little city is what it is. And also in terms of our demographics, you can see where African Americans students represent 36.5, Hispanic 28.7. So you can see that, interestingly, probably over the last, I would say 10 years, our Hispanic Latino population has grown exponentially. And so that's been an emerging, in terms of thinking about culture responsive instruction, that's something that our district has really been starting to focus on within the last 5 years for that. So how did we get here? Some of the things that we've had in terms of areas of success. I mean, we started out with PBIS in terms of Fidelity. We actually did an excellent job at the point. So we started around 2004 with implementing PBIS, and we actually were able to implement it in well over 115 schools within around 6 years. We also implemented an early intervening services model because of disproportionality. Interesting thing is that when we were implementing PBIS with Fidelity, we did not have disproportionality, which was something that was very interesting. And I think that also proves out in the PBIS research too. We've been working on MTSS installation in terms of trying to combine the PBIS and the RTI into MTSS. We've got a foothold in actually implementing of restorative practices, culture proficiency, and also using more representative text. But in doing all of that, do we still have a problem? Yes. Just like with other districts, our out of school suspensions, we have, in terms of our special education graduation rates, alternative placement, even in terms of have we even closed the achievement gap. And like with other, I think, districts, the last year or so, we've probably seen those gaps widen. And to what extent, we still won't know. It'll probably be a while before we have a full grasp as to how much of those gaps have widened. But the key thing is that with all that we've been doing, what was the impact on African American male students? There were, of all the things that you see that in terms of where we've had areas of success, nothing was actually targeted for African American male students. And so I think that's interesting because also historically, African American male students have lagged behind their peers for decades. But in terms of the intentionality of trying to support their outcomes and improving outcomes for them, it hasn't not been there. So this is where we are. Jackie and I, we looking at the numbers, looking at the data, getting really frustrated with what's going on. And so we were fortunate enough to get when partnering with RTI, to get a research study. There was a call put out for projects, and we were fortunate enough to get a 3-year project. We identified 8 treatment high schools, and they're aligned control schools. Excuse me. And then in terms of benefits and what they were going to get, these treatment schools were going to get targeted professional development for school staff. We were going to have on-site coaching for the treatment group. There was going to be technical assistance with model customization because our schools were different in terms of their needs. So we could customize a model of support for African American male students. They were going to get access to this resource repository, data tools. There's going to be professional development. And most importantly, we got the district to understand that there had to be considerations for heavy lifting of these schools. So everyone was really applauding, when we got this grant going, great, great. And I'm going to myself, you guys don't know what's coming. This is work. We're talking about fundamentally changing the way schools operate and what that focus is. And so I think, and that really just goes to the idea that a lot of folks believe that we can just, if we just fix these students, we don't have to worry about changing ourselves. But also for any of those who have worked with high schools or actually work in high schools, you also know that high school is all about the schedule and how much that schedule is so important, and changing one thing in that schedule impacts everything else. So, and we're doing all these things, and all the things that I listed earlier, it was not done through a cultural lens, and especially looking at through the lens at African-American male students. And I typically don't like to read slides, but I'm actually going to read this quote. "I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it's as though I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they only see me, see my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imaginations. Indeed, everything and anything except me." And that's a quote by Ralph Ellison from the book, The Invisible Man. And when I've done this quote and read it, so many of the audience members go, amazing that someone could actually feel this way. And even though this book was written decades ago, it still applies. There are folks in the audience when I read this quote that says, that's me. I still feel that way now. And these are adults that are saying this. And so when we're talking about schools, what is it that, and students, and African-American students, how much do we really understand about those that are sitting within our classrooms? And I just want to point out we don't have time to go through them now, but the foundational theories that we based our model on being racial identity development by William Cross, male reference group by Jay Wade, which is very key to our processes, but also the invisible man syndrome by Anderson Franklin. And I would urge you to actually research those theories because they're very important if you're looking at achieving equity for African-American and Latino male students. So the model defined it's a customized school instructional model, which builds the cultural competence of school staff. And you see the key word being self-efficacy model. And if we were to actually go in and say that it's a little bit of a misnomer because we talk about it in terms of African-American male self-efficacy. If we were to actually go in and say, oh, we're really gonna be working on the self-efficacy of teachers, we would get an immediate pushback and go, oh no, I'm fine. I know my methods work. I don't have an issue here. But if we talk about students, in people's minds, they're like, well, yeah, if you're coming in here to fix these kids, I don't have a problem. Come on in. So we had to go at it from there in order just to be able to start the conversation. But our overarching research question was, will the improvement of teacher self-efficacy for MTSS, restorative practices, and culturally responsive instruction, our key levers, improve the self-efficacy and outcomes for African-American male high school students? So basically we're saying, if we are able to improve teacher self-confidence, will that result in better outcomes and self-confidence for African-American male students? And this is our overarching model. And so we looked at what are all the things that we would need to do if we were going to look at improving the outcomes for African-American males. And we looked at academics, behavior, social skills, and of course, within the PBIS framework, using that tiered instructional model. But one of the things that we actually added on to the framework was, how do we also get culturally competent school staff? You cannot apply a simple solution to a complex problem. The issue of African-American male outcomes has been there for decades. If it was simple enough to be solved, it would have been solved by now. And we're still struggling with it. And so a lot of the cultural competence training only focuses on awareness. The goal is just to raise awareness. It doesn't up the knowledge of staff, and that knowledge doesn't have to translate into skill, but also that skill also needs to translate into action. And that's one of the things I think is really missing, because, and even it's amazing, is that when we started doing our first training for staff, they said, I know all the statistics, I know all of this stuff, but what are we going to do about it? So the good thing is that people do want to do things about it. It's just, we got to help them in terms of what to do. Okay. So our simple theory of action is that if we install MTSS, we're going to have get a positive school climate. And we know positive school climate also comes from positive school culture, and it's the interaction of the persons within that building. We're going to install restorative practices, and that's going to help with positive interpersonal relationships. If we install culture responsive instruction, then we're going to get positive academic achievement. So if you think about it from the standpoint of our MTSS, where we have PBIS and RTI, we're saying culture responsive instruction is actually our academic side. And installing that will actually help you if we're looking to achieve that equity. So included, and whenever we're doing things, and especially think through the restorative practices model, we want to say it's so important to do things with rather than to. And this quote I thought was, it was, I think, really eye-opening. And so this is an actual conversation between a CMS who was a teacher. Actually, she was one of our grant staff, and her son. And she was just at home one day, and the son said, I want to be white. And she's African-American, he's African-American. And the son says, I want to be white. And so, and the mom asked the son, why do you want to be white? Because then the police might like me. This is kindergarten. Kindergarten. From everything that was happening with George Floyd, the news, this kindergartner is already having those considerations of his own skin tone, his own race, ethnicity is something less than, and not something to be desired. And he even wants to separate it. But on the flip side, you know what he's also saying? He's seeing that he believes that there is a power dynamic in terms of being white in your skin versus being Black or African American at kindergarten. So we can say that, you know, kids don't really recognize, and truly, I think they don't. They don't see race. They don't care what color you are. They're just going to play with whomever. But I do think we need to understand the lens and how things may be coming into their minds, and how we then also need to be able to deal with that on a school level, and the things that might be said in terms of that. So why is teacher self-efficacy so important? Again, you see the work by John Hattie, and then there was and how the impact of collective teacher efficacy and that impact on learning. And then also there are included this quote from Nancy Prothero. So saying that a teacher may have faith generally in the ability of teachers to reach difficult children while lacking confidence in his or her personal teaching ability. So you know how we say in education, oh yes, we are teachers and we are here to teach, and all children can learn. And we say that from the collective, but meanwhile, individually, I may doubt my own ability. And we always say that kids can smell a fake. If you don't have confidence in your own abilities, then and kids will see that. And so, and it comes out. Parents can see it also. And so it's so important that when we're thinking about it, rather than looking at, quote, I keep using this term, fixing the child, we have to do work with teachers and where teachers are with their own confidence, because confidence comes through having repetition and success, repetition and success. So if you as a teacher have never had success in teaching a certain group or teaching a certain subject, then it's very hard to then transfer that confidence onto your students. And so one of the things that we also did, we surveyed in 2019, we surveyed about 129 African-American Latino male students, and we asked them some simple questions. We said, what can teachers and school staff do to support the needs of African-American Latino male students? We had a 12th grader Latino be more involved personally. and take more of a real world connection with them. You understand what we're saying there. When we say real world, they're saying there's the book, but do you understand our lives? And can you apply the information to our lives? So that goes to relevance. The teacher being able to bridge the relevance of the content to their students' lives. And another student said, become more interested in their students by listening rather than just coming to school to teach and get paid. Relationships. And so if you're not able to establish those relationships, you don't understand who I am, it's very hard to teach me. Most interestingly, when we ask the students about their confidence to do the work, overwhelmingly, they said, I can do the work. I just don't have help from teachers to help me do the work. So the self-efficacy of the students is there. What we're missing is what's the self-efficacy of the teachers to support the students. So when we're talking about culturally competent staff, again, I talked about moving beyond the awareness, and we kind of set up kind of a, I guess you might say, a scale and a scope as to where we want to go with that cultural competence. And you see where we started with the awareness as far as who am I, and that includes the student, the teacher. Knowledge, who are my students? Do I understand them? Skill, what is my level of performance of actually making the content relevant and bridging it to my students? But then also actions. What is my toolbox? And building that toolbox over time so that you're moving from teacher perception of who their students are, but you also got to know who you are, moving into what are the facts and information that I know about my students, and then behavioral mastery. Am I able to write and design a culturally responsive lesson in my content? And then am I able to put it into practice? And so, and the key thing that I will say through all of this is also being authentic. Being authentic with your moves, your toolbox, and also then what you're doing. So year one hurdles that we learned is that everyone has a belief about how to, quote, fix Black males. That's important because even though we had a set model, we had a set methodology where we were going, we were getting all these ideas of this is what you need to do and this is what you need to do. And we had to stick to this is what we were doing. And actually, it really worked out having the research study because we can say it's a federal research study. Sorry, we have to go by what our grant said. And while a lot of folks will actually have, they want the district at the district level, they want to make changes, but the system is designed to unintentionally not achieve that. That's important because schools, districts are institutions. Institutions are very slow to change. And so, in a way, institutions are designed to protect themselves. And so sometimes we got to think there has to be a push from the inside, but also a push from the outside to get those changes made. You got to have a staff curriculum. That was one of the biggest challenges that we had during year one is that how do we actually train coaches to actually support schools to get this work? And what's the PD that's going to happen to actually change behavior? So, because this is about, remember in the slide I showed you, we want to move away from, or I should say above awareness, and we want to move into actual skill development and making things happen. So you got to have that curriculum, have it set out in terms of where you want to go. Many districts are data rich, but information poor. We were ready to go. We were like, oh my goodness, we got all this stuff going. And all of a sudden the coaches came back to Jack and myself and saying, they don't have it. What do you mean they don't have it? Well, the schools are saying don't they have access to this data? Can't they break it down by ethnicity and gender? They don't have it. And they kept telling, and we're like, what do you mean? So that totally derailed our year one. We had to fall back and we found out that the data was not available in the format to make decisions about equity, which was amazing because our accountability department does a great job in terms of all kinds of equity. But what we found out, no one ever asked the questions that we were asking before, which was amazing to us and hard to believe. And here's the other part. High schools are hard. I think we originally were going to start with elementary schools because, we wanted to get prevention. But the funding was there for high schools. And actually, I'm glad we actually were able to do the research with high schools, because if we were able to show gains with high schools, then it's a little bit easier. It's not easy, but it's a little bit easier to actually move elementaries with this work. So I'll leave you with this quote and then I'm going to pass it off to Jackie, in that we often find it hard to look beyond the symptoms. Have honest, non-defensive, and non-blaming conversations about issues that affect those who experience disparities. That come from Dr. David Osher. That was also one of the biggest things we had, that there is difficulty in discussing race. There's defensiveness. We talked about, we would have implicit bias training, and the big pushback was, you're calling me racist. And we had to keep saying, no, everyone has bias. Everyone has bias. Just because we're talking about bias does not mean we're saying anyone is racist. And so we had to keep saying that and messaging those things over and over again. But I think it's so important that be aware that there will be pushback. Be aware that this is uncomfortable, but someone has to keep pushing the discussion, the decisions, but most importantly, the data has to be what you lead with. And so I'm going to pass it over to Jackie, who's going to talk about our data collection and how we supported our discussions.
Thanks, Edwin. Yeah, so we are lucky that we had this grant and we could focus on it, because a lot of times you can't do that with schools. Excuse me. And we, as Edwin just said, data was our friend, because we weren't saying, equity is a word that's thrown around a lot. But when you actually have data, instead of us just saying your school needs to be more equitable, we're going to let the data speak for itself. So we had a big plan of all this data that we were going to use for the research project. And we needed to use a lot of data because the researchers were wanting it, but also we wanted the data as well to find out how we were doing as along the way. So for PBIS, we had several fidelity measures. We did not get to use the set more than year one because of COVID, but we did use the TFI regularly. The FAMS is something North Carolina DPI requires, Department of Instruction requires. So we would do the TFI quarters 1 through 3 and the FAMS quarter 4. We used meeting minutes to see, are they having meetings? Are they problem solving? What are they doing there? And we started out doing classroom observations for 9th grade core teachers. Like we were using the classroom coaching model and going through and using that observation tool. The outcome data that we had planned, ODRs, well, with COVID, we had no office discipline referrals from March 2019 on, so we could not use that as outcome data to see how we did. District student survey data and staff data survey also did not happen 1 year while we were in COVID, but we have a school climate survey, and I'll share some results from that. That was specifically for just the research schools. For restorative practices, we had each teacher just create a RP circle fidelity log, meaning that they were implementing it. It didn't say how well the circle was or anything like that, just how many circles. And that was really eye-opening, and made it just like a quick 3-question thing on a Google Doc so we could create, have a place to look at all of them. And then RP Observe is with Ann Gregory through Rutgers. And she came and trained us on, that is where we're looking for quality of circles. We did it 1 year, and then it was COVID, and we weren't able to get to all the classrooms the second year when we went into remote learning. Again, the data's not always available, but the school climate survey, again, will give us some data on that. And then for culturally responsive instruction, we used PLC meeting minutes. These are the meetings that they had like a CRI implementation team, and they created a plan and talked about where they were with implementation and also lesson planning. We were trying to create a repository of lesson plans for like every, social studies, English, science, like all different ones so teachers could use them. Outcome data is how many students or how many staff actually took it. And then the district survey data would have had specific questions, but we could also use the school climate survey for that one. So I'm going to go ahead and actually share some data with you now. Edwin mentioned earlier that we, before I get into our specific grant data outcome, Edwin said that schools had no idea how to really find this information easily. A huge hurdle in teams is that they sit around and we, in PBIS, we use that term admiring the data. We just look at it. We spend so much time figuring it out. Our process was the data analysts before the meeting, and a lot of times the coach would sit with them, and they created that precise problem solving statement, and then the team would problem solve. So here is a data dashboard that we actually created with accountability. It was no easy task. It was many meetings and they were great, but basically we took all this data that's in our system called Navigator and put it in one place. And we did it by demographics, which is what you see here, just like the percentage of enrollment, breakdown, and specifically our grant was looking at males, EC eligibility, and things like that. So then we get into our ABC data. If you're not familiar with that term means, I know it means one thing when we're doing FBAs, but this is a whole different topic we're on. So it's attendance, behavior, and course content. And so the first question there on number 5, that's your attendance. And Edwin, you can go to the next slide. And then we're looking at behavior. Current number of students that received a discipline action, and then we built right in the risk index. And if you're not familiar with that, you can look it up, but it's basically comparing one group to another. So we always chose to compare, African-American males to white males. So like in this particular school's examples, you're 19% higher chance of getting a referral than a white counterpart in your school. And we did that same thing with, that one was ODRs, and we did the same thing with suspensions as well. And then we went to the course content. So our biggest thing that we see is if kids don't finish Math 1 and English 1, which is your freshman math and English, if they don't pass those successfully, their risk of not graduating on time or graduating at all is so much greater. So we were really focusing on 9th grade, and we wanted to know how many kids attempted it and how many kids passed. And we broke it again down by subgroup. So we could see number of students that attempted but did not earn versus, so 77 in this example, African-American males tried to take Math English 1, but only 50 and 54 did not earn it. So that means we're talking about like 20% of our students actually earned it. So what's wrong with that versus white students, 257 attempted it and only 10 did not make it. So we're really pushing them to look at those things for Math 1 and English 1. And then we also looked at the percentage of 9th grade male students for each subgroup that was retained from the year before. So this data, let's pretend it's 2021-22 school year. These are the students that got retained from last year and are repeating 9th grade. And so it's again broken down by subgroup. So we were really happy to have that, and we continue to use it to this day. It's one of those things that when you're looking at products that you can keep forever, we now have this in CMS as a resource for as long as they keep it in the system. So many of you are familiar with the TFI, the Tiered Fidelity Inventory. We really use this to its fullest. We really relied on TFI, especially during COVID when there was really nothing else that we could sometimes get them to do because a lot of things required in person, like the classroom observations, RP observations, things like that. This was something we could always do. And we had them completed 3 quarters, and then the FAMS was always done the 4th quarter. School gets a copy and the coach goes over the results with them. We use the PBIS apps and they get all of their information. And this is going from, so we did fall, we just compared fall 2008, 2019, and 2020 for all 7 of our schools. And installed 1 tier each year was our original idea, and I'll get into that in a minute. But so this results are just for tier 1. And 100% of the schools establish an active tier 1 team. 5 of 7, 71% attended the 2-day training at the beginning, and we got the other schools later on. 77% increase in tier 1 Fidelity between year 1 and 2. That was huge. And this was all in person. So just within 1 year, their TFI, which a lead 2020 coach was supporting them. So it wasn't just like exaggerated self-reporting. They were being helped fill that out. That's a huge increase. And one high school achieved 80% fidelity of tier 1 during year 1 implementation. And they ended up being our strongest school throughout the time. So the fact that we just started out at 37.5 and a year later jumped that much, even, and then stayed steady, even in remote instruction, they were able to keep it at the same level. And as Edwin said, high schools are really hard to implement. Just getting a team together because they're not used to having all those as is an elementary. And one other point, like if we looked at these two scores, like the 66.7 and 64.14 for all 7 schools, we had one school that was fairly low. It was kind of an outlier. So if we had taken that out, we would have been over 80% for the other 6 schools. One of the other data points that was huge for us for self-efficacy, for looking at implementation at schools, was what was called a school climate survey. This was done by RTI. They sent out the survey, they collected all the information, and they made nice little graphics for each school. And so remember, Edwin said one of our overarching research questions, was will the improvement of teacher self-efficacy for MTSS, restorative practices, and culturally responsive instruction improve self-efficacy of African-American male high school students and the teachers that are teaching them? So what we have here is school perspectives on outcomes for the research activities. This one is the classroom management. Remember, our theory of action is PBIS or MTSS in the classroom is one of them. And then we have restorative practices and culturally responsive instruction. This is the classroom management, MTSS behavior, PBIS, whatever you want to call it. What's interesting here is that from 2019, so this is 2019, 2021, and I'll let you look at these in more detail later, is that we went up in pretty much every area except for error correction. And this was even with remote learning going on. You can go to the next one. So this is restorative practices self-efficacy. And what was really cool about this one is we went from 45% reporting using restorative circles to 66% in just 1 year. And that was huge, just getting them to use the circles. And we had the fidelity logs that teachers filled out to correlate with that. And we went from 60% to 78% for feeling confident in running circles. We went from 70 to 78% in using practices like effective questioning with students. And then we went from 75 to 83% in feeling supported by admin. And that was huge, that admin was leading it and they felt supported that they could use classroom time for this. Go ahead. And the last part of our implementation is the multicultural self-efficacy for staff. And this was this was our last item that we were training on. So we trained it on year 2. So the other restorative practices and MTSS, they got trained on that the first year. This, we waited until second year on purpose, getting their foundations in. They had implicit bias the first year, and then we were teaching them how to actually create those lessons and integrate it into instruction. So none of the numbers really swayed too much, and that's not surprising. This is the one component that we did not get off the ground as much as we wanted to. We had great implementation plans starting in October the second year, and then like schools were starting them in December, getting those lessons done, and then remote learning happened. And while we know that having culturally responsive instruction, even in a remote environment, would have been so beneficial to keep those students engaged and making it relevant to their lives, we know that teachers were stressed. Many of them have never taught remote learning, and it just kind of went to the wayside. Okay. When the research study was coming to a close and we were in remote learning still, we were really thinking, how can we help all the coaches were going to go away. So they, they weren't going to have these coaches to support them anymore. And have we really created that sustainability? And again, with remote learning, that was very hard because everyone was kind of on their own. They weren't teaming as much. They weren't implementing in the school together. So starting around December, January, we really focused on sustaining implementation. And we used all the data that we've been collecting, from the survey results, the TFI, other observations, and saying, here's what we need in order to sustain implementation. And then each meeting afterwards with, we met monthly or quarterly, and we had a couple of extra meetings. And then we had a summer training this summer, was all focused on at least one of these 6 areas at a time. And we shared the staff this slide starting in, I'd say, around January every time. And we connected what we were doing to one thing that we're helping them sustain implementation, so that when the research study was over, they weren't like, okay, on to the next thing. We wanted them to really buy in and see that they have this to do them on their own. Edwin talked about hurdles, and we had a few. I mean, besides COVID, we just had a few. And we have a district where some schools, have like 30% turnover. And so we really had to work with schools on, we were going to provide more PD, we were going to offer refreshers, but we were also going to create an onboarding system for them for new staff. And we ended up making like a template for an onboarding PowerPoint that they would do every year, and then new teachers might get a little bit more. So we knew that them creating something from scratch was going to be a hardship. So we really tried to give them tools while still giving them ownership and having to do some of the work to individualize it. The Think Partners was huge. It wasn't just like another committee. And we actually got the suggestion at one of the live APBSs years, or NAPC, I'm not sure, years ago, and to create Think Partners in the school. And what we did is all the people that work with equity, that they have equity goals, whether it be exceptional children, student discipline, Title IX, we got people from all over the district that were in leadership positions that also had equity. We actually have equity specialists that as their goals, and came together, and we give them updates on our model, ways to troubleshoot, ways that we can align it with work already going on in the district. And it was just invaluable, that time together. And it also helped create more talk and more understanding of how this model really could go district-wide. And while data is wonderful, we really learned that telling stories, Edwin's a great storyteller. So we, putting together reports and in a story format with data integrated, telling how we've been doing, what we've been doing, really including those student voices, the impact, kept it in the forefront of people's minds of what we're doing, and kept the schools motivated to keep part of it, that you may not see all this, but it's happening. You may feel like you're in the thick of it and only doing like, meetings and work and documents, but actually there's an impact. And that this wasn't just the next idea. One great thing about, we did not create anything new. We took in PBIS, we took in restorative practices and culturally responsive instruction. We did not create anything new. What we did is, schools are throwing so many things at them all the time. How do we align them together? So that was what a benefit to that was. We did create district level plan, and we're still working on eliminating the my department's training is more, and we're trying to show how they align and train other departments together. So that's still a struggle, and I'm sure we're not alone in that. With year 4, there's actually an example of what we're talking about, this theory of action for equity. It's in the file section. What we found probably a little later than we wanted to, but it just worked out this last summer when we were helping schools create their sustainability plans, we needed them to document and verbalize what their theory of action of equity. We talk so much about equity. Yes, of course we want equity. Yeah, what's our plan to actually get there? And Edwin mentioned these 3 theories before. We shared those with the schools. They were integrated into our training. And sometimes a little bit more and sometimes just mentioned, but they are looping and getting them all the time of understanding this is our why. This is how we're doing this. And it's not just talking about equity, but we're actually going to have a plan for it. we've learned so many lessons. We could have had about 30 slides on lessons learned, but some of the most important ones are teacher self-efficacy and positively be impacted by professional development and coaching. We had planned to have our coaches in July or June or July before the school year started. So I didn't even start till, August 8th or 10th or something. Most of our coaches didn't start until close to or after school started. So we missed a whole month or two that we were planning on training them, and they have to know restorative practices, culturally responsive instruction, PBIS, and they also got to know coaching, and they have to know data drill downs, and they had to know all these things. And they were getting frustrated because they're out in schools and don't have these skills. But we also know that the more the coaches and the people supporting the schools understand it, the more teacher self-efficacy there will be. And don't assume that implementation hesitancy by the school means they aren't concerned. Everyone's so overwhelmed, and they just are worried about a lot of them are just protecting their teachers. I don't want more on their plate, or I'm already doing this initiative. So it's our job to help them understand how the initiatives blend together, or are they doing too many of the same initiatives that aren't meeting the outcomes that they want, and working with them on that. We've seen that starting with restorative practices or starting with culturally responsive instruction is not going to get the most for you than if you start with your actual foundational systems and framework of PBIS, MTSS. So that is kind of where you should always start. And the actionable data is accessible to school teams. That's why we were created that ABC equity dashboard and building those action plans. And then really being accountable. We always say that we want to address disparities with accountable measures, but sometimes we just are talking about equity. When you have school teams looking at data, grades by grade level or by department level and not breaking down by subgroup, you are not being accountable, and you are not using that data to address disparities. So the biggest thing we ever learned is to be flexible. And this is hard because sometimes I'm not a flexible person. I'm like, no, we said we were going to do this and we got to do this. And then Edwin goes, yeah, but that ain't going to happen right now. So if you look at what we originally had sought out to do was a tier a year. And I think if we were in elementary, we might have been able to do that. We never got to tier 3 because we were so focused on some of the schools really needed almost 2 years, if not a little bit more, to really get their tier 1 in place. We plan to have restorative classrooms in all restorative circles in all classrooms. And then we're like, how about 9th grade? And then in the end, only 5 out of our 7 schools actually were trained in restorative circles. And then culturally responsive, we always said we were going to start with 9th and 10th grade. And then after the research study expanded, or if a school wanted it to be all, we decided 9th grade. And they did all receive the training. In the end, because of COVID and remote learning, we really just had about 1 out of 7 schools that fully implemented. They followed through with their implementation plan. Teachers had lesson plans. They were teaching them. So again, being flexible. So now what? The research study is over, but CMS, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, really found great value in the model. And what they did is they invested in 7 positions for the whole district. Now, mind you, we were, if you count me, we were 9 positions for the whole district for 8 schools, sorry. And then the second year we went down to about 3 coaches. So we're going from coach had that the most 3 schools to now has about 30 schools. It's not exactly what we wanted, but we're going to take it, and we're excited for the opportunity to continue the model. And we're now including Latino males. We're using that TFI as much as we can as a baseline for district for the district and also for each school. So we can kind of customize what they need. We make it really easy for them. We're providing webinars. We'll go out to schools and do it with them. We're never handing the TFI to a school and saying, do it. We actually have like an hour-long webinar where they can stop and fill it out as a team. We explain each one, and we can do that in person as well. And they actually complete their scores, put it in a Google Doc, and we've got them all for the whole district. It's pretty amazing. So we transitioned a lot of our professional development to online, like self-paced, self-paced courses. And this we did because of, some great things come out of remote learning. This was one of them. And we now have these courses, yes, that we can tweak as years go on, but they're there forever. And they can easily be accessed by district-wide, and between the 7 district positions, we are splitting up on, grading them and providing support. And they can be also provided live or hybrid, which we actually are doing with some schools. And we are doing a heavy emphasis on teacher support. We're really trying to focus on if you have your foundation going on, you have your school-wide expectations and your behavior flow chart and definitions and lesson plans, let's move that into the classroom. And we are actually using the classroom coaching model to support teachers in the classroom and, providing them, that support through observation, but also goal setting and going back and helping them progress monitor. This is specifically what these 7 positions will do. And again, we are assigned, and it's confusing because we have MTSS specialists in our district that are responsible for everything, tiers 1 through 3, both academic and behavior. And North Carolina has an integrated model where we don't really separate academics and behavior, but the district, saw that the model was working and also knew that our MTSS core behavior was often the most skipped over, that we are kind of taking that and focusing on that. We support the leadership teams. We integrate with the attendance specialist and the social emotional learning specialist, and we're just trying to help them get their core on how behavior, attendance, social emotional learning all support each other. And a big thing that we're really trying to push this year is root cause and data drill down for them to really understand, not just be aware of the problem, as Edwin said, but what is the root cause so that we can effectively put core strategies, or if needed, interventions in place. And we're doing a lot of support with teachers, as we said, and we're monitoring that participation activity for all our courses to see, the interest from the district in that. And also we want to look for outcomes for teachers who have participated. We've kind of pared down our professional development moving forward. And again, it includes Latino male support as well. These are a mixture of ones that would be district-wide for teams, and then other ones that would be individual for teachers or teams at a school, a mix of hybrid and in-person and asynchronous. So I hope I made the data somewhat exciting. And there is the session evaluation. I just wanted to leave it there on the same because we would love to hear some questions from you all.
Thanks, Jackie and Edwin. There are no questions at this point, either in polls or chat. I think your information is pretty clear. I think, like the rest of us, a bit overwhelmed with the amount of work. I really appreciated the kind of practical, okay, given that we're not adding anything this year, what would be the starting point? And the message I heard was to go back to your foundation pieces, but then add these conversations and kind of do these double checks, if you will, relative to cultural competency, relative to cultural relevancy. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, so we definitely say to start with your PBIS foundation, and we integrate like how to make it classroom or how to make it culturally responsive. We use a lot of the same PBIS materials that's available and other people use as well. Edwin, you want to say anything more?
Yeah, because I think we were lucky to have funding to be able to do a one-to-one in terms of coaching. And we know that that is not probably going to happen with most school districts. So from the very beginning, we were saying, okay, what does this look like to replicate? How can we scale it up? And I think the thing that we really came up with, what are those key things that we can still do? And it's kind of interesting because year one, our big aha was data. And now that we're looking to transition, our big aha is still data and data usage. And so putting things in place so that people have data at their fingertips, but also helping them provide the training on how to look at their data and turn it into action. Because for so many schools, I think they get overwhelmed. You look at your inequity and you go, oh my goodness, where do we even start? But by using the root cause analysis and data drill down in looking at that, it actually just, and especially I proposed the TIPS model is really what it kind of comes down to as far as using TIPS to be able to move into actionable steps. And biting off the, the whole thing about, how do you do something by one step at a time? And I think it goes the same thing for equity. Start with one step, one area at a time. Because what we had to compete with is everyone wants equity fixed now. They like quick fix, we want to fix it now. But in fact, this is a 2-year, 3-year process that you should be thinking about in terms of more long-term. The whole idea of it's a marathon, not a sprint. I mean, I know we've heard that before. So I think that's kind of where we are.
Excellent. Yeah, I tell my districts, stop thinking 2 to 3 years. You got to think a decade. Yeah. You want to fundamentally change how you're doing business. Mm-hmm. We did get a question in chat. How did you keep your school board updated with the work you were doing?
Yeah, one of the things is that we actually did reports, and we were very targeted as to when. And so we would feed our director information, just saying where we were and what we were doing. And we included pictures. So not just a written kind of narrative, but like Jackie was saying, people also like the pictures also help to communicate what we're doing. And so we would provide updates. We were limited in terms of, we couldn't, because until the study's really over, you can't really give, hard kinds of data. But we would talk about like how much professional development we've done, how many people have attended, actually school principals and assistant principals gave a lot of good feedback in terms of how things were doing. So, and because boards get so much information, we kind of did it more of a annual. So our director got like a semester report, but then the board would get like an annual update as to how we were doing.
And they would do special requests as well. Like this last year, they wanted to know some specific information, and then we'll, they put in a request for information or data, and then we provide it to our supervisor who provides it to them.
Right.
So we got another question. Can you talk a little about kind of some of the community supports? Did you engage them in this process and how that went?
One big thing that we did do with the community is we were trying, it was supposed to be an annual event where we had a minority male event where they came, and we coordinated with someone else in the district who also had some grant money, and we got a bunch of speakers, whether it be from mental health or colleges, and kids actually went. It was almost a conference for kids. And they got to hear speakers that were relevant to them and spoke to them. And so we got a lot of a community involvement in that way. And I know at like another school, they have big community involvement with the boys groups. Edwin, did you mention the minority males group? And so that would be a lot of our community support. And Edwin, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you're right, because one partner we had, there was a chapter of the National Alliance of Black School Educators and they did a lot of community events. And so, and like Jackie said, we had found groups internally. University of North Carolina at Charlotte, also there was in their urban education. So we wanted to reach out more, but like I said, and we actually were able to get some partners to help sponsor some events. So it's also with the African American Museum and holding some events there and partnerships. But COVID just kind of put everything to a stop, and so, but we did hope to do more of that.
Great. I knew the PBIS crew would step up with questions. Another question, realizing COVID, realizing kind of the short-term project, but did you see changes in parent and family involvement by putting this in place?
That wasn't one of our measures. But to be honest, and yeah, it wasn't one of our measures, but I will say, I wish we could have shown a video, but we actually showed one of the groups and kind of outsets that we did create. We created this boys group, and there was 20 students, African-American Latino males, and they met. So they were their own little PLC. They met like once a month. Some schools, they met twice a month. And in the video, and they actually used restorative practices to conduct their meetings. And this wasn't your best and brightest, you know, because sometimes we want to choose the student body president and all this stuff. This was just, I'll use the term, if there is such a thing, of the average kid. And they came, and interestingly, they started recruiting friends. And they talked about, at the end, we actually had them speak at our final training to staff. And they talked about what having that circle and that time to meet, just to talk about what their experiences were and what that meant to them. And they talked about how they would take it for the rest of their life and how it changed in terms of what they wanted to do. And even in terms of how, because with this one group, the whole idea was that we were going to train them to be peer mentors. And one school was able to actually take it all the way through. And those students actually, they were, as seniors, they got to talk to the ninth graders, the incoming freshmen, about what it is to be a student here. This is what I think you should do. I'm here if you want to reach out to me. So we were kind of creating this whole peer advisory. And again, everything keeps getting derailed. But the video from these students, I mean, at the end, when they were talking about what they were achieving, some were going to community college, some were going to off to do other things. I mean, the tears, I mean, it was bringing everyone to tears, because we were like, this is why we did all this hard work. And so I will say, we didn't have the measure with the parents, but in terms of that question of, does the self-efficacy, improving self-efficacy of staff, impact self-efficacy of students? With this one school that had consistency with Fidelity all the way through, we saw the result. We did see the result.
Absolutely. And sometimes those voices speak a lot louder than our data. And at the end of the day, it's all about those improvements. Even if it's a small group of 30 kids, right. We're making progress. We're moving in the right direction. We've got no more questions. Any final thoughts, Edwin, Jackie, or words of encouragement to the folks that are listening in?
Dream big. This was a lot of work that probably 2 years in the making before. It started off with like Edwin and I writing it on a napkin on an airplane coming home from one of the other presentations and being like, this is what we need. And then Edwin did a lot of the legwork of working with grants, and that took 2 years. And then we got it, and we had to change and, really be flexible, as I said, but it's possible. Like, did we get everything we want? Absolutely not. Are we still, especially get COVID, I don't think we would have gotten everything we wanted either, but it's worth it. And these are already practices that are in schools. This is nothing new. We have to help schools align these practices and how they fit together, because that's when they'll drop, oh, I'm not going to do restorative practices anymore because we're doing SEL, or we're not doing, you really have to help them align all those practices.
Yeah, I think Jackie and I were fortunate. I mean, that we were able to partner together for so many years to be able to stick to something. And I think we were really fortunate here. And it's not about having necessarily an additional source of funding. It's about how can you use the resources that you have for long-term planning. Like Tim was saying, the whole 10 years. If we can take out the turnover in superintendents, board members, in principals, all of that, and just say, we believe in equity and developing a theory of action for equity. So many schools and districts say we want to achieve it, but there's not a set plan in terms of how they're going to do it. And I think that's the place to start, and lead with data. Lead with data. So important.
Great. Well, thank you both for a really informative session. Reminder again, complete the evaluation. We're always looking to improve the forum and be responsive to the great folks who participate. So thanks, everyone. Thank you again, Jackie and Edwin.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you.